up and tap additional expertise. And so I contacted our next speaker, Keeton, who has been down here to talk, has worked with us on the wetlands and woodlands effort, and has really been a leader in understanding forest dynamics and their consequences related to harvesting activity in New England. So he's going to talk about biomass energy harvesting and its consequences on the forest. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you, David. It's really great to be back here. And as David said, I'm going to talk today about wood biomass energy. And like the last speaker, this is a synthesis of work that members of my lab have done. So I want to make sure that I recognize them right off the bat. Cable Littlefield and Anna Mika, and then Thomas Buchholz. And then also with me today are two other members of my lab. I'll just introduce them, Dima Karavchuk and Russell Roy. So we're going to talk today about a couple aspects of this work, focusing on effects on stand structure and wildlife habitat characteristics, and carbon fluxes resulting from bioenergy harvest. And for any of you who are interested in this, looking for more information, this work will come out hopefully sometime this year in these two journals. So the carbon piece will be in Global Change Bioenergy, and the effects on structure piece will be in ecological applications. Okay, so just a little bit on the context for wood biomass energy and some of the politics and the debate. I'm sure most people in this room are familiar with the Manomet Center's report. It's related a lot of discussion, shall we say, about wood energy. And there's been quite a bit of debate back and forth over the last 2 years about wood energy, particularly whether or not we can make an assumption of carbon neutrality, or whether there might be lagged effects until we achieve some sort of net emissions reduction sometime in the future. And my take on this is that given the amount of debate and given the amount of uncertainty, that's probably why the US EPA decided to defer the greenhouse gas permitting requirements for biomass energy plants for a few years until we could get a better handle on this issue and some of the carbon accounting involved. And meanwhile, EPA had another framework looking at carbon stock change on the landscape as a way of understanding whether there's some offsets occurring. And so we'll talk more about landscape level carbon changes in a minute. So, this would suggest that there's still a lot of uncertainty on this issue, and still a lot that we need to know about carbon fluxes associated with wood energy. And so my lab has taken that on, and that's something that we're looking at. And then the other aspect of this is that many states nationwide are really actively promoting wood energy. And we see a number of different pieces of legislation coming up for consideration in many states, both in the East and the West. And in many cases, these state bills include things like this, and I know you can't really read this table, it's just here for dramatic effect, but they're recommending harvesting guidelines specific to biomass energy harvests. So things like structural retention, avoiding debris and snags and that sort of thing. But in many cases, the legislation, the state level guidelines, are essentially regurgitating the same set of fairly limited papers kind of over and over again. The fairly limited number of peer-reviewed papers on woody debris volumes under different harvest systems and different forest types and that sort of thing. And if you take a really close look at that literature, very few of those studies have addressed wood energy harvest specifically. And also there's just a tremendous amount of variability among states in terms of specific guidelines and requirements. And by the way, I should add Vermont to this list now. I've been on Vermont's Wood Biomass Energy Working Group for the last 2 years, and just this January we released our harvesting guidelines for the state of Vermont. And I will be the first to admit they're also based on that fairly limited set of papers in the literature. So this is another gap in our knowledge that my lab hopes to address. So I'll be presenting to you then these two pieces of our work, the effects on stand structure and wildlife habitat characteristics using a number of structural indicators like downwind debris. And then also the question of which factors most strongly influence variability in that post-harvest structural retention. So that's really the first part of the talk, where I focus on structure. And then in the second part of my talk, I'm going to address the carbon flux issue. Those are the two pieces I want to get through. Both of these projects have used the same data set. This has been a nice model in my lab the last couple of years. We've had several people all working together, collecting a unified data set that we can then break out into a number of different research components. The data come from 35 sites around mostly central and northern Vermont, a couple of sites over in Vermont, and then a few up in northern New Hampshire. These are all sites that have been harvested for bioenergy within the last 3 years. And although I would have loved to have done a before and after comparison, it just wasn't possible in this case. So we had to make do with a comparison of the harvested sites against an adjacent area of the same stand in each case that was not harvested as a reference. These sites were selected using a variety of site matching criteria, so they're all essentially northern hardwood or mixed hardwood hemlock forests, mature, either 2 or 3 aged in terms of their age class structure. But I want to focus on this aspect of the data set for a second. The sites encompass a range of different harvesting intensities, a variety of different types of bioenergy harvests. This is really an important aspect of the study because if you look at the literature, the relatively few number of published studies on bioenergy harvests have tended to dramatically simplify reality in that they classify harvests as either bioenergy harvests or non-bioenergy harvests. And that is really not the reality, not the case in terms of what's happening out there on the landscape. Bioenergy is typically just one of many different products that comes off of harvest in the northern forest region. It's part of a larger mix of products, and the amount of the volume that's actually allocated to bioenergy applications can vary tremendously, from 5% of the harvest to as much as 100%. So in this study, we wanted to encompass a variety of different types of harvesting systems, including whole tree harvesting, and we wanted to capture that full gradient of allocation of bioenergy. And I'm just going to go off on a little bit of a tangent here for 1 second. One thing that we did not include in this data set were clear cuts or patch cuts like this one. Here's a patch cut put in this winter right here in the Berkshires in Massachusetts on a property I'm doing a little bit of work on. Very representative of a form of harvesting that I'm seeing increasing very dramatically in frequency around New England. 10 years ago, I was saying that our dominant harvesting system in New England is partial harvesting. That was true at the time. But over the last decade, we're seeing more and more patch cutting for a variety of reasons. There's an interesting discussion around this particular system that I'm not going to get into today, but I think that we're likely to see a lot more of this in the future. The USDA Forest Service's silvicultural guide for northern hardwoods is being revised right now, and it's going to strongly advocate more patch cutting in the future. So this is a very important part of the mix of harvesting on our landscape now, and it's likely to become even more so in the future. So I'm mentioning this because we didn't include it in the data set. If we had some of the contrasts that I'm going to point out in my talk between whole tree harvesting systems, for instance, and systems that have a lot of volume going to bioenergy, and harvests that have less of that, would be even more dramatic had we included patch cuts, because these tend to produce a lot of low-grade material, a lot of unmerchantable material that's either being used as cordwood, firewood, or is being shipped for bioenergy applications. So just an important thing to consider in the future, maybe as we pursue kind of future research needs and that sort of thing, something that I'd like to look at. Okay, so in those 35 sites, we conducted a very intensive subsampling. I like to put out lots of plots within my sites to capture spatial heterogeneity, which is really important, especially if it's some kind of a selection system, single tree selection or group selection, or even a thinning, some kind of partial harvesting system, because they tend to be very patchy and spatially heterogeneous in their effects. Within each plot, we did a full workup of kind of above ground structure, various different habitat indicators, like snag densities, large tree densities, down crowns, weed debris, that sort of thing, and also fine weed debris, which is very time-consuming and difficult to sample, should I say. And then we generated a whole number of different calculations using NED2, that's the Northeastern Ecosystem Management Decision Model that allows you to generate a suite of stand structure metrics very quickly and easily, volume estimates for woody debris and fine woody debris. And I have this slide in my talk because I just needed to explain this particular metric here for a second, the percent difference metric, which is something we grabbed from the literature as a way to compare changes or differences between the harvested sites and the reference sites. Since it's not a true before and after comparison, we can't call this, percent change or something like that. So we use this percent difference metric that relativizes some of these measures. I'm not going to go into a lot more detail on that today. And then the structural diversity index, which is a nice metric for looking at forest structure in aggregate. So rather than individual metrics like snag density or large tree density, this gives us a way of aggregating various dimensions of vertical complexity and horizontal complexity. Okay, so now some of the results. And again, this is the structure piece of the talk. And I have a number of very simple slides like this one to just highlight some of the differences between the sites harvested for bioenergy and the reference sites. For the sites that had no whole tree harvesting, for those of you who are not as familiar with this, whole tree harvesting is a practice where the entire above ground portion of the tree is harvested and removed from the site, and then various different portions of that can either go towards saw logs or pulp logs, and then some part of the tree might be chipped and used for a variety of different energy applications. And so it tends to be the most intensive form of bioenergy harvesting that we see in our landscape, and so it was something that we wanted to look at in particular. The sites that were not whole tree harvested tended to actually increase the volume of downweed debris available on the site, whereas the sites that were whole tree harvested saw a decrease or a negative percent difference, if you will, in downweed debris availability. Similar effects on the structural diversity index, that H index. Very little change in that aggregate measure of structural complexity for the non-whole tree harvested sites, a significant difference for the whole tree harvested sites. And then this is something new, I'd like to think. It's pretty intuitive, it's not shocking, but we couldn't find any data in the published literature on downed tree crowns. And yet, if you think about it, this is a really important structural feature to look at, especially if we're interested in things like effects of whole tree harvesting on nutrient availability and nutrient budgets. And there has been quite a bit of work on that. And of course, the primary way in which nutrients would be recruited from slash is through retention of down crowns on sites. And so we wanted to look at that. If in whole tree harvesting we're removing those crowns from the site, then we might get into some of these nutrient impairment issues, and we maybe want to look at those. We haven't done that yet in our work, but other people are looking at that. So what we see here is that for the non-whole tree harvested sites, the availability of down tree crowns increases significantly post-harvest, or at least there's this dramatic percent difference between harvested and reference. Whereas that change in the availability of down tree crowns is much lower for the whole tree harvest. A few crowns being left on site where they've missed those, where they haven't been able to pull them out for some reason, but in general, much lower availability of down tree crowns on site. Okay, so I mentioned that an important aspect of the study is to consider bioenergy essentially as a continuous variable, rather than those simple categorical comparisons that I was showing you before. before, recognizing that the amount of harvested volume allocated to bioenergy can vary tremendously as part of this overall mix. And it was interesting to look at some of these structural responses this way. So we've got live biomass, structural diversity index, snag density. And when you plot those against the percent going to bioenergy, this might be an indicator maybe of sort of how intensive the harvest was in terms of trying to produce material for bioenergy. There was essentially no relationship in this data set whatsoever. These trend lines are flat and not statistically significant in any way. So the amount that's going to bioenergy in and of itself does not seem to be a strong predictor of structural effects or effects on habitat characteristics. And I think the take home from this is just that we want to be careful about generalizing about bioenergy part of this. And it's not necessarily that the ones producing more bioenergy material are going to have more significant effects. Maybe there's something else going on here, something a little more subtle that we need to look at. And so that's the final piece of this part of the talk. I better speed this up a little bit. As part of the study, we collected a lot of additional data about these harvests. So who owned the property? Were the sites certified? Was a professional or a consulting forester involved? What kind of machinery, harvesting and skidding machinery were they using? What were the specific silvicultural treatments and management objectives and all that sort of thing? And then all this information was fed into a multivariate analysis. And like Jonathan this morning, I really like classification and regression trees. These are a very useful and robust form of multivariate analysis. They're non-parametric, so there's no assumption of normality. They can handle both categorical and continuous variables, and the output is just very clean and simple and easy to interpret. So we put into this analysis the things you might have expected, the predictor variables that you might have expected, like percent allocation of bioenergy, whole tree harvest versus not whole tree harvest, those sorts of things. And none of those floated to the top as being most predictive in some kind of structural outcome down here at the bottom. So the dependent variable here at the bottom of the tree is this percent difference metric, in this case, for coarse debris volume. Well, we did this for lots of different things, structural diversity index and other metrics. In every case, other predictors were identified in the card as being most strongly related to the response variable down here. So things like the specific silvicultural treatment, the type of machinery that was used. Was it big, heavy, large grapple skidding, or was it smaller cable skidding or horse logging or something like that? Those sorts of variables were the most predictive of the structural effects. So again, it suggests that there's a lot going on out there, and even though there's an association between the biomass harvesting in some cases and the use of big, heavy equipment and maybe more intensive silvicultural treatments, we need to be careful about generalizing. There's actually a tremendous amount of variability that we're seeing in this data set in terms of structural responses. I want to come back to that point at the very end of my talk. So now a little bit on the carbon. So again, the context for this is, well, at least for us, has been the Manomet study. So the Manomet study really provoked a lot of thinking, and especially in terms of their debt and dividend model, this idea that if we start producing or harvesting a lot more wood for bioenergy uses, depending on energy substitution effects, which type of energy we're substituting for, coal or natural gas in specific applications, it's thermal or electric, there would be some sort of debt in terms of a net carbon plus to the atmosphere, and then a lag time during which you are offsetting or compensating for fossil fuel emissions, meanwhile regrowing the forest, until at some point in the future, depending on the type of energy application, you achieve this dividend, this net reduction in greenhouse gas concentrations or emissions. And this has generated a tremendous amount of controversy, and there have been a whole variety of sort of criticisms of that model, which in my opinion is helpful. This is a good thing. You know, we need a provocative model like that to stimulate debate, to stimulate conversation, and to advance the science. And I'd like to say that that's what's playing out right now. But one of the objections to the management model was that it was overly stand-based. It was just sort of, you know, simulating the dynamics of individual stands. And some people have said, well, at a landscape scale, you have these equilibrium effects where individual harvests that are staggered over time and space and scheduled in a temporally offset manner will compensate for one another over time. So the sort of net effect of multiple harvests staggered over time and space is this equilibrium carbon storage condition on the landscape, representing little or no net flux to the atmosphere. Well, I don't completely buy that criticism. Actually, in the interest of time, I think I'm going to skip this slide. This was just just really briefly. The EPA agrees that the landscape scale question is really important. And so that's what they're monitoring right now in terms of net carbon stock changes in the landscape. Okay, but I said I don't completely buy the objection that there's this equilibrium condition on the landscape that will be maintained, and here's why. So here's a conceptual model that my lab is currently testing. If you think about it, we can think about an individual stand that's experiencing these partial harvests over time, and that scenario for that stand over some time horizon has an average level of carbon storage that it's maintaining. If we add in a second stand, and so I'm going to use this as a hypothetical landscape composed of two stands, the average amount of carbon storage, if we have these harvests that are staggered over time, might come up a little bit. So I buy that argument. But what happens if we intensify these harvests a little bit every time we go into these stands? So now, instead of just removing the material that we would have anyway, the merchantable materials, the saw logs, the pulp logs, we're now pulling a little bit more of the unmerchantable material and using that for bioenergy. So we're intensifying these harvests a little bit at each entry, and then they grow back like this. That's going to lower that equilibrium carbon storage condition on the landscape. And it's that difference right there, that's the kind of magical number that we need to come up with in order to understand how long it's going to take to compensate for that change by offsetting fossil fuel emissions. So that's the number that we're looking for here. Now, answering this question or addressing this is going to be very complicated. So Anna Mika, in her PhD dissertation, is now doing the kind of landscape scale, long-term monitoring to really understand this. But the first piece of her work was just to understand this part of the equation, whether or not we can assume that there will be an intensification of harvesting and an associated flux of carbon in the atmosphere. So we put a lot of work into quantifying the carbon pools in this data set, a lot of various different transformations that we had to go through. And suffice it to say, we've also included estimates of carbon transfer into wood products. So that is included in the results that I'm about to present now. She put a lot of work into calculating carbon fluxes associated with different energy applications associated with these harvests. So unlike some other studies that have made a lot of assumptions about where the material is going and what form of energy it's being used for, in our data set we have real numbers in that we know exactly where all the material went, which plant it went to, or which thermal application, which boiler it went to, so we can get real numbers in terms of these different energy uses and then maybe fossil fuel substitutions over here. Okay, so then the data. As before with the structural information, the greatest effects that we saw on the different post-harvest carbon pools were associated with the whole tree harvest. So those were the harvests that had the greatest contrast against those reference sites in terms of their residual above-ground carbon pools. That was particularly the case for snag carbon. Total stand carbon, similar results, although also a net reduction for the bioenergy harvest that did not include poultry harvesting. And here's the final, sort of the clincher slide, the really important one. When you put everything together in terms of the amount of carbon left in the forest, the amount of carbon transferred into wood products, the fossil fuel offsets gained through whatever type of energy is generated from this material, we can think about kind of the net carbon fluxes, or the immediate post-harvest net carbon fluxes associated with these different types of harvesting. And again, the greatest carbon flux was associated with the whole tree harvesting regime. And what we think the data are showing us is that indeed there is some degree of intensification of carbon flux, but particularly so if your bioenergy harvests include poultry removal. And then I'm almost there, I think, David, so you giving me the signal. Again, we performed a cart at the very end to look at the same issues I mentioned before. And again, whether or not it was a bioenergy harvest or the amount of material going to bioenergy did not emerge as most predictive of net carbon flux down here at the bottom. Instead, it was the type of machinery and the specific silvicultural regime. And this is consistent with what a field forester would tell you. That there's just so much variability out there, and the devil's in the details in terms of specifically how we do this. And so this was just a picture to show you an example of a large cat grapple skidder in this case, and it was the really heavy machinery like this that we saw opening up the stand a lot more and leading to a greater degree of carbon flux. So choice of machinery, particular choice of silvicultural treatment plays an important role in this. So what have we learned? This is the final slide to wrap it up. My party line here is that we can harvest biomass in an ecologically sustainable way if we acknowledge that there is a huge variability out there in the specific management practices. So there's good and there's bad, good, bad, and ugly, right? So that means there's room for improvement. Some people are doing a great job. Other people could improve. There's some concerns, though, like snag retention, that are cross-cutting. We didn't see, there was just depletion of snags across all the harvests that we looked at, not just bioenergy harvests. So lack of snag retention remains, I think, an important issue for all types of forestry out there in the landscape. So that's something that we need to keep thinking about. We need to develop meaty harvesting guidelines and procurement standards. So we can set that bar in terms of best management practices, set it high, set it where some people are, at the level that some people are already achieving, and encourage others to come up to that standard. But our results, infer that maybe there is this potential to incur a near-term carbon debt, especially if it involves expanded use of large machinery and poultry harvesting. So for policy and legislation, this is something that we could really think about. These are, these are points that we can think about in terms of what we might want to recommend to landowners and operators. If the concern is reducing that initial carbon flux. I hope that was clear. And I just want to acknowledge our funding sources and the Carbon Dynamics Lab, whose work this really is. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much. There are a number of people who are very interested in this topic, and Bill, and we're going to engage Bill as much as we can in helping to develop our research program and move on so we have less time to interact with him. I'll take one question, if there is one, and then I'd like to move on so we can wrap up the afternoon. Mike?
A quick comment on slack retention guidelines. Sure. As a practicing forester, a number of years I've been designing and supervising forest biomass harvest of my landowners. And one of my concerns is the proposed slack retention guidelines for portability by biomass improvement plans. So I'd like to see a study done on incidental slack retention during these partial cleaning periods. I contend that there's enough incidental slash retention during the filling and screening process, as well as cleaning up periodic and chip of plant material, these mandatory retention guidelines aren't necessary. So I think this would be a good area to study. We're in dire need of these low-grade markets to restore.
No, I don't disagree with you.
There's a legacy of the past high grading.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that question. I would say that our data show that there's a huge range in slash retention. You know, there can be a lot, but in other cases, there can be very little. So I think partially, you know, how much you see out there might reflect your own experience, and so that's something to consider. I think that some of the harvesting guidelines that we are seeing coming online now. So, for instance, our new guidelines in Vermont. I'm also thinking of Forest Guild's recently released guidelines. I think recognizes that perhaps we should have a sliding scale of recommended slash retention, depending on the specific management objective of the stand, depending on the current condition of the stand. You know, because there's just the potential for slash retention is going to vary tremendously. If you're in a mature forest with lots of big trees and structural complexity, it's easier to leave more slash. If you're in a young, pole-sized stand that you need to do stand improvement cutting in, there's just less potential to leave slash, right? So we could think about a sliding scale that reflects, you know, some of the situations that you're encountering. So I'm not sure if I fully addressed your question.
There'll be an opportunity in half an hour to address it. This is great because it combines some really important practical on-the-ground activity with some very important science. Well, I have ceded my time at the end of this program to the next bunch by